Hi all. This is a presentation about Chapter 8 in the Chapuis text, Personal Communication as Classroom Assessment. There are 5 different forms of personal communication assessment that the authors discuss in this chapter. The benefits of personal communication as a form of assessment are that we do it constantly as teachers. So I think the authors here are just asking us to spend a little bit more time considering that the interactions that we have with our students are a form of assessment, and so we should spend more time reflecting on the questions that we're going to use in a lesson or the kinds of feedback that we're probably going to be giving to students. Personal communication can be used formatively or summatively. Frequently, we do use it more in terms of a formative assessment, of giving students formative feedback on things as they move towards a more summative assessment. Personal communication can assist us with also getting students to reflect on their own learning and tell us what problems that they're having, so they can help us figure out what students' views are. We can find out what their misconceptions about a concept are. Personal communication can help us develop relationships with our students and can also help deepen students' conceptual understanding and reasoning proficiencies, as long as we're using questioning appropriately. Our authors of this text note that we can use personal communication to assess knowledge, reasoning, and skills learning targets. On page 266, the authors show those different formats that I went over at the beginning and kind of describe what that is, and then tell if it's formative or summative and the types of learning targets that we could use for that. So that's just a nice summation of these different forms of personal communication. In the other assessment forms that we were looking at, selected response, written response, and performance assessment, sampling was considered to be, like, especially in a selected response, sampling relates to how many items do I have for a particular learning target. With personal communication, sampling has 2 sort of levels. One is sampling the learning, which is like, how many questions do I need to ask to make sure that I have enough information about whether or not the students understand this concept. And then the second thing is sampling the population. So we can't just allow those students who always answer the questions during a class discussion to dominate everything. We need to hear from a number of students in order to be able to really use personal communication as a form of formative assessment. So we need to avoid simply calling on volunteers and find other ways to get more students involved in class discussions or even, individual conversations with teachers. So just because a child, doesn't say that they have any questions about something doesn't mean that they don't, or doesn't mean that they understand every single thing. So along with this idea of sampling, the authors developed several ideas, several suggestions for maximizing student engagement. And thing number 1 is providing sufficient wait time. And here they discuss the importance of getting students to understand what the wait time is for. So you might actually tell them, okay, I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about the question. You might even repeat the question or make sure they understood the question, and then give them that time. And that way they're not like, what's going on? They know that the silent time is for them to actually think about it for a few seconds on their own. You might have students that would even benefit from, jotting down a few ideas. You can encourage them to do that. You want to, as I mentioned, call on volunteers and non-volunteers. And sometimes kids are hesitant to participate. In that case, you might feel bad about calling on them if they don't volunteer because you don't want to spotlight them. In that case, I would recommend telling the student, I am going to call on you. You can say, can I call on you for this question? You can talk to them quietly and kind of get their buy-in and consent to participating. You could use cooperative learning structures like think, pair, share, or numbered heads together to maximize more student engagement. You could ask students to write down a response and then collect them and read random ones aloud without identifying specific students, and you could use clickers or response boards. The last point here is super important and relates to your classroom environment and just establishing a classroom environment within which everybody's contribution is valued, everybody is sort of expected to contribute, and we're going to be putting each other up and helping each other out and not bringing each other down if we say something that's a little off base. So yeah, that's just an important aspect to think about, is what kind of classroom environment are you creating that will help also maximize student engagement, especially if we want to be able to use personal communication for effective formative assessment. Increasing wait time has had a number of benefits, including, allowing students to develop their responses with more depth, more student involvement in general, and especially from students who might not normally participate. Another form of personal communication is class discussions. And class discussions, I think, relate to instructional questions because you can't really have a class discussion if you didn't come up with some questions to begin with. Class discussions, we could potentially use class discussion as a form of formative or summative assessment. Here we have like an example rubric that they shared in our text. In the Common Core, for example, it's important for students to develop the ability to engage in classroom discussions. So if you're planning to use a discussion to assess students, you will need to come up with a checklist or a rubric for that. Conferences and interviews are another great form of personal communication and frequently would occur one-on-one. So here you could give students feedback with regards to really anything. Like I was observing some videos about using science notebooks, and the teachers were giving the students feedback on how they use data in their responses. So if you're a math teacher, you might have individual meetings with students to talk with the kids about how they're, if they're doing writing within math or they have to show their work, you might have brief individual meetings with students to ask them questions and get feedback from them on how much they understood, what their problem-solving process was, all that good stuff. Conferences can allow you to get to know your students better, and it can really help also build that relationship with the student. And they just make a note, with the same thing with conferences as portfolios and other things. You want to make sure you select a few different work samples or a couple different work samples that you want to discuss with a child and plan the questions that you want to use in advance. And it might be useful to find, always find something positive that the student is progressing in, as well as, okay, here are a few areas that you might work on. And with students of any level, but particularly students as they're moving up through the elementary school years and into middle and high school, should also come prepared and having reflected on their work as well. The last area for personal communication are journals and blogs. And so these are written forms of personal communication, such as a dialogue journal would be, for example, you asking the child an initial question, they can give you a response using words or visuals or a combination thereof, and then you provide a response back to them, and you sort of model and develop writing through that in a more informal way. Journals and logs can and should be related to specific learning targets, or can be more for getting to know your students and making them more comfortable in your classroom. And then you as a teacher can respond, or you can have students respond to one another as well. But I would say if you're asking the students to complete a journal or a log, take the time to respond to them. You can always decide, well, I'm going to respond to 5 students or 8 students per week, or however many that you can handle, that you're not going to be overwhelmed. But that way your students can, if you're asking them to do it, they can make sure that they're getting something out of it, and you're getting something out of it as well. What are some of the sources of bias with personal communication? One thing might be sort of a breakdown of communication, like if the students literally didn't understand the question that you were asking, or if your question wasn't clear enough, that could cause a problem. But it's usually going to make itself known fairly quickly. If your students didn't understand you, they're not going to be able to answer your question clearly. On page 284 through 286, they discuss some of the different types of biases that could occur with personal communication and ways to safeguard against these. I think one of the main things is just trying to pay attention to all of your students and making sure that everybody has a chance to participate, and that you're going back to that sampling piece, that you're getting enough feedback from enough different kinds of kids that you have an idea that you're coming to the right conclusion about whether students are learning or not. So I think that wraps up this session. Thank you for your time and attention.